Force Pull has saved many Force users in battle against their enemies. This ability allows one to draw objects, such as a lightsaber or other useful items, close to oneself. It relies on telekinesis, enabling Jedi to pull their enemies closer as well. However, the effective use of this ability strongly depends on the user's skill. If the object or person being pulled weighs as much as Jabba the Hutt, using Force Pull might be futile. Force Pull also comes in handy when users find themselves near chasms that separate them from distant enemies during combat. Some powerful Jedi and even Force users on the dark side have used this ability to bring down massive ships, such as Star Destroyers. Tulak Hord, a Dark Lord of the Sith, also known as the Lord of Hate, was said to have applied Force Pull on a Hammerhead-class cruiser, bringing it down to the surface of a planet. Totally insane! Galen Merrick, Darth Vader's apprentice, also employed Force Pull on a weakened Imperial I-class Star Destroyer on Raxus Prime, causing even more damage to the already crumbling ship. This Force power goes beyond one's own feelings. It allows users to perceive the feelings of others. Whether it's a traumatic event, a future occurrence, a disturbance, or impending danger, Force Sense brings all of these to awareness. Think of it like Spider-Man's Spider Sense, but you wouldn't find any Jedi or Dark Side Force user saying, "Ooh, my Force senses are tingling." Yeesh. Another aspect of this ability is how one can fight without relying on physical senses. Sometimes the Force provides directional prompts, guiding what to do or avoid, which could be based on the future or in the moment. This amazing ability was among the first things taught to Padawans, as mastering and heightening their Force sense was essential. Every Force-sensitive being is born with it. Through this power, Kylo Ren in the Star Wars The Force Awakens Episode 7 was able to easily sense the presence of his father, Han Solo, on Starkiller Base. Force Push is essentially the opposite of Force Pull. Instead of bringing people or objects closer, it tosses them into the air, or in any direction the wielder seems fit. It is not always used as a defensive response. Sometimes it's also used offensively against an approaching enemy or thrown object. The skill level of the wielder determines the strength of this ability, allowing them to create a massive outburst of Force energy after charging up for a few seconds. So basically, the stronger you are, the better you get with Force Push. On the planet Mustafar, Darth Vader and Jedi Master Obi-Wan Kenobi used Force Push against each other, throwing each other backward in the process. The Wookiee Jedi Master Kelnaka employed this ability while under the mind control of a coven of Force-sensitive witches in the Acolyte. He used this power against Saul and Torben, his fellow Jedi allies, hurling them with extreme force into a wall. Force Lightning is a visible Force power, one that can be clearly seen in action and demonstrated through its effects. Unlike telekinetically inclined Force powers, when used, it can cause an opponent's skeleton to glow as they're blasted by it. While Force Lightning is more commonly associated with the dark side, it seems to be a favorite of many. The name alone carries an aura, and its display is undeniably satisfying to watch. The power inflicts enormous and excruciating pain on opponents, to the point that the hands of the wielder often emit smoke afterward. Just badass. Though maybe we could change its name to the ultimate badass Force move. Forget it. You've got to respect Force Lightning, especially after seeing it used by the fearsome Palpatine. Count Dooku also used this power on his apprentices, Asajj Ventress and Savage Opress. To deepen Savage's connection to the Force and feed on his hate, Dooku exposed him to enormous doses of Force Lightning. What a way to make someone tap into their potential. Yeesh. On the other hand, as punishment for her disobedience and betrayal, Asajj Ventress received several strokes of Force Lightning from Count Dooku, leaving visible dark lines on her skin. Force Repulse is a deadly ball-like kinetic force attack emitted by wielders to destroy and disrupt objects and individuals around them. This power was also known as Force Pulse. The telekinetic explosions from a Force Repulse were so violent that even its ripples in space were often avoided by opponents. You have to be incredibly strong and probably immovable to stand against a Force Repulse, but even then it would be a dangerous move. This ability was used by both Jedi and Dark Side Force users, and Darth Vader being one of its most skillful practitioners. He also trained his apprentice, the formidable Starkiller, in the art of Force Repulsing. Kaboom! And that's all you hear when this Force power comes at you. Force Shockwave is deadly, dangerous, and destructive. It sends battle droids flying into the air, screaming, "We're doomed!" The Force Shockwave is known by many names. Some call it the Force Bomb. which aptly describes what this power can do. Others refer to it as the Focus Shockwave, another name that captures its destructive nature. This ring of energy proves incredibly useful when surrounded by enemies, giving the Force user a swift victory in battle. Jedi Master Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker were knocked off their feet along with a group of battle droids while fighting Savage Opress, proving this Force power as merciless, clearing and pushing everything in its path. Force Stasis is a telekinetically inclined Force ability that causes opponents to become immobile, keeping them in a state of stasis, hence the name. When facing enemies, it provides wielders with a quick advantage. It can also be used to stop or freeze objects thrown in their direction. In Star Wars The Clone Wars, the diminutive yet powerful Master Yoda uses this ability to stop Asajj Ventress from killing King Katunko. Darth Vader also employed this Force power to slow the explosion of a grenade during his attack on Brightholme, allowing him to escape before it spread. Similar to the Mind Probe, the Mind Trick gives Force users access to the minds of their victims, allowing them to manipulate their thoughts and even actions. This mind-altering ability is also known by other names, Mind Touch and Mind Form. Let's hear what Jedi Master Luke Skywalker has to say about this ability. This ability works particularly well on the weak-minded, but some species, including Hutts and Toydarians, are naturally immune to its influence. While it took 3 Jedi Masters in Star Wars The Clone Wars to extract info from the mind of the resilient Cad Bane, it would only take one with a death wish to attempt using it on Jabba. Force Choke is one of the most popular and feared Force powers. It allows Force users to choke their opponents from any distance, making it a deadly offensive technique. This telekinetic ability enables the user to squeeze the throat of their enemies, rendering them helpless. By using the Force to grip their opponent's neck, Force users make it nearly impossible for the victim to resist. Darth Vader is the primary user of this power, with numerous instances where he choked both enemies and disobedient subordinates. Emperor Palpatine, too, could use this ability remotely, even when speaking to someone through a hologram. A particularly tragic moment occurred when Anakin, having fallen to the dark side and lost control of his temper, choked his pregnant wife, Padme Amidala, in Revenge of the Sith. Force Destruction is a havoc-wreaking Force power. This ability allows wielders to create a massive energy field with paralytic effects on their opponents. Users build up this Force energy, often drawing from the dark side, and can release it at close range or from a distance. The immense power generated by this ability requires significant energy and effort from the user. Naturally, this can lead to quick exhaustion, but it is highly effective against formidable opponents. One of the most notable users of this power was the Miraluka Jedi Master Jarek. He employed Force Destruction in the Valley of the Jedi against Kyle Katarn. Darth Vader also used this power in Star Wars The Force Unleashed when battling Galen Marek. Force Barrier allows Force users to face their enemies without the need for physical shields, making them appear dauntless and fearless, as using a shield would seem redundant. The Force Barrier is somewhat similar to Force Push, but it is primarily used as a defensive technique and sometimes even offensively. With this power, wielders can block blaster shots and deflect lightsaber strikes by creating a protective Force shield around themselves. Some Force users have even succeeded in deflecting heavy shots from launchers and other powerful weapons. There are other Force powers that share similar functionality to the Force Barrier, including Force Resistance, Protection Bubble, and Force Resilience. In Star Wars The Clone Wars, Yoda, Anakin Skywalker, and Aayla Secura used the Force Barrier to protect both Palpatine and Padme Amidala from a poisonous gas cloud. Jedi Master Obi-Wan Kenobi also employed this technique to block shots from a sonic boom grenade launcher fired at him by a bounty hunter. Force Resilience is a Force power that acts as an immunity ability against other Force powers. By developing an aura around the wielder, Force Resilience makes users impenetrable and nearly invulnerable to massive explosions and heavy impact attacks. Think of it like a Force wielder walking through fire and blast, much like the Terminator. The Jedi Sentinels, a branch of the Jedi Order known for their exceptional combat skills and extensive knowledge of the Force, focused on developing Force Resilience specifically against the dark side. This focus gave them near invulnerability to Force powers that induce fear and disorientation. The Force Orb, which I'd call the Aqua Force power, is the only Force ability that works underwater. Developed from pure Force energy, the Force Orb is exceptional in both nature and effect. With a strong bubble of air, Jedi Masters like Kit Fisto could disable crab cannons. In the Battle of Mon Cala, Kit Fisto used the Force Orb to create a temporary breathing helmet for Padme Amidala, allowing her to breathe underwater. Who knew a Force power could save you from the hassle of wearing an oxygen mask? Or whatever they wore in space water. This ability came at Force users on its own accord when they were unconscious or asleep. That is, Force users really never needed to summon or deliberately experience Force visions. However, this does not mean they could not make a connection to this ability by themselves. Force visions were not to be taken too seriously because the emotions of Force users could cloud their judgment on whatever they saw in their visions. The Force power provided sight into the past, future, and other places in time. Anakin Skywalker, through Force visions, witnessed his mother's death, his wife's death, and also saw himself become Darth Vader in Star Wars The Clone Wars and Revenge of the Sith. Force healing is a rare and miraculous Force ability. Wielders of this power can extend their hands to the wounded or to areas affected by poisoning in order to heal or revive a loved one. However, this comes at a cost, as the healer pours their own life energy into the other person. This transfer of energy drains the healer's strength, and in more serious cases, especially in the context of a Force Dyad, it can result in the healer sacrificing their own life for the other. Anakin, Grogu, and Rey are seen using Force healing in The Mandalorian, The Clone Wars, and Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker, to heal or even bring their loved ones back to life. Closely related to the Force Shockwave is the Force Wave, another crowd control Force power that sends enemies into the air, scattering them in different directions. It provides the wielder with more time to plan their next move and land a finishing strike while enemies are stunned and trying to recover. The Force Wave is essentially useful when surrounded by a large group of opponents. Many Force users have employed this ability in battle, including Mace Windu, Yoda, and Darth Bane. Numerous others skilled in this Force power have demonstrated how powerful and damaging it can be when facing multiple enemies. Force Shadow is a stealthy Force power recognized as a dark side ability. The name alone gives you the heebie-jeebies. With Force Shadow, Force wielders can project themselves into different locations, using the stealthy nature of shadows to remain undetected. This ability was particularly useful for the Force Hounds of the Infinite Empire, as it allowed them to easily detect and locate areas with exceptional concentrations of Force energy. Force Blast is a more intense Force power that not only throws enemies off balance, but also sends them flying a long distance away. This ability is an advanced version of Force Push, wasting no time in launching enemies far from the wielder. With this technique, Force users can quickly knock their enemies to the ground and claim victory. One blast from this power and you're like a gunner. Combining this ability with other Force powers makes any user nearly impenetrable and extremely difficult to defeat. The two most prominent users of this ability remain Darth Vader and his formidable apprentice, Galen Marek. Force Blinding was a powerful Force power used by both Sith and Jedi. Its effect focused on causing temporal blindness on victims, giving their opponents an advantage in battle over them or enough time to flee. This ability was considered a Force power belonging or more associated with the light side. However, Dark Jedi Yoon is one of the few who has employed this Force ability in battle. This Force ability is very opposite of Force Blinding. While Force Blinding seeks to cause an opponent to startle and experience blindness for a short period of time, Force Sight was to enhance the visual sight of Force users. It is kind of like Force Sense, only that it dwelt more on sight. Even though Kanan Jarrus in Star Wars Rebels was blind, he learnt to rely on this Force power when fighting against opponents, and when doing normal stuff Jedi do. It doesn't always have to be about fighting. Force Space was a Force ability for instant teleportation, for both beings and objects. Jedi Master Luke Skywalker also learned to use this Force ability when he visited the Ang-Ti homeworld with his son, Jedi Knight Ben Skywalker. It also allowed Force users to be impervious to Force pull, push, or grab. With Precognition, Force users had insight and depth into matters of the future. The Force power was also called Foresight, and known by the near-human species called the Chiss as the Third Sight. Before Anakin Skywalker became Darth Vader, he used this ability to know when enemies would strike or where an attack could come from. Among the Chiss, females were mostly the ones born with Force-sensitive abilities, which were used to help navigate ships. However, this force power lost its strength among them as they got older. Seems theirs had an expiry date. The Force Dyad was an ability involving the pairing of two Force users, creating a Force bond or connection that allowed both individuals to see, sense, and feel the same things. This bond was not restricted by distance or time. In Star Wars IX: The Rise of Skywalker, Ben Solo and Rey exhibit this bond, discovering they could sense things and connect with each other through the Force. Force empathy shows us that Force powers aren't just about tossing enemies into the air, blocking blaster shots, and performing other impressive feats. There's also an emotional side to them. Force empathy is the ability that allows Force-sensitive individuals to sense the feelings of others. It reveals the emotional state of individuals, uncovering hidden secrets, thoughts, and motives, whether good or evil. During the first Battle of Geonosis, Master Yoda employed Force empathy to resolve a heated argument between Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker. The argument centered around Padme Amidala's fall from a Lat gunship, and Yoda could sense the tension between the two Jedi Masters. Force Enrage is another Force power that taps into emotions. Though it is most commonly associated with Force users from the dark side, it is an ability that requires users to harness every bit of their negative emotions — pain, anger, hate, fear — weaponizing them to become more powerful. This power often increases a user's stamina and strength. However, due to the intense nature of the ability, users can grow weak after prolonged use, requiring time to recover as their diabolically fused rage begins to fizzle out. You would find the likes of Darth Vader and Kylo Ren unleashing full rage on their opponents whenever they tapped into Force Enrage or Focused Rage, as it is sometimes called. With Force Slow, wielders almost seemed as though they could control time. However, this Force ability primarily affected a victim's mental and physical state, causing them to slow down. It was used by both Sith and Dark Jedi. A variant of this ability was Force Exhaustion. There are other Force powers with similar effects to Force Slow, including Force Affliction and Force Plague. Force Affliction affected victims like poison, while Force Plague was a deadlier ability compared to Force Affliction. The Jedi Guardians who fought in the Cold War and the Galactic War used Force Slow to gain a solid advantage over their foes. This Force power goes by many names: Aura of Insignificance, Force Invisibility, and Force Camouflage. It was a technique used by Force wielders to avoid detection, and a rare ability among them. Behind this technique was the skill and ability to bend light and sound waves photokinetically, making the Force users undetectable and invisible within enemy lines. Though it was a difficult skill to master, the likes of Luke Skywalker and Jaden Korr achieved mastery in the use of this resourceful Force power. Among the Jedi, Electric Judgment was a forbidden Force power. Other names for this dangerous ability included Emerald Lightning and Fingertip Lightning, as it allowed users to fire intense bolts of electricity through their hands or fingers. This made it very similar to Force Lightning. The main difference between this Jedi ability and Force Lightning, a dark side ability, was their applications. A Jedi would use Electric Judgment with a well-examined and determined sense of justice, whereas Force Lightning was typically lethal and anger-induced. Luke Skywalker, Plo Koon, and Jacen Solo were some of the most well-known users of this Force technique. Tutaminis was the general term and classification for Force abilities related to absorbing energy. This Force power was taught to Padawans to show them how possible it is for users to generate and absorb the kind of energy found in lightsabers and blaster bolts. The technique of Force absorption was not exclusive to the Jedi. Other Force wielders outside the Jedi Order also used this ability. One iconic demonstration of this power occurs in Star Wars Episode II: Attack of the Clones, where Master Yoda is shown absorbing Darth Tyrannus' Force Lightning. Force Speed allows Force users to move like speedsters in just a few seconds. The advantage provided by this ability was in the user's reaction and responses to enemy attacks. For the user, the world or space around them would be in slow motion, while to their opponents, they're elusive and almost as fast as lightning speed. The only downside to this ability was that it relied on the energy of the wielder, meaning moving at such great speeds too repeatedly would lead to exhaustion. Obi-Wan Kenobi and his master Qui-Gon Jinn in The Phantom Menace used this Force power to escape from destroyer droids, or better known as droidicas on a droid control ship. Lightning Shield worked similarly to Force Lightning. It was another variant of Force Lightning used defensively against enemy attacks. However, it could still shock nearby enemies. With the Lightning Shield, Force users could also remain airborne for some time while dealing with their opponents. Those who could effectively use this Force power were typically masters of Force Lightning, such as Palpatine, Darth Nox, and Luke Skywalker. What the Forced Rend did to the bodies of many victims was diabolical. The Force power enabled wielders to not only telekinetically lift their opponents, but to distort and subject their bodies to unnatural bending positions. Such was a gruesome and highly brutish sight to behold, as the bodies of victims were squashed as if they were paper being squeezed. One instance of this is in Star Wars Destiny Legacies, where a rebel trooper is attacked with Force Rend, his body contorted in midair as he drops his blaster pistol from the excruciating pain of the Force power. The strength of this Force power and the extent of its damage rested on time and energy. Force-sensitive individuals would create a transparent Force energy around themselves, charging up to release a huge and deadly blast. The Force energy around them could either be blue, green, or red, for those on the dark side. However, opponents who were also Force-sensitive could deflect this move using a protection bubble. Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi employed this ability in the game Star Wars Episode I Jedi Power Battles. The Sith Seeker was known to inflict significant damage upon enemies. It often followed a heavy Force push, where users would send their opponents into the air and gift them a ball of Force lightning as they traveled mid-air. It was a wicked move, and who could have executed it with more style than the rage-filled and defiant Galen Marek? Levitation made it possible for Force-sensitive individuals to float in mid-air. This Force power was mostly used by Jedi during meditation. It made the ability appear redundant and unuseful in battle. Jedi Knight Des Raiden once explained that levitation could only be used in less stressful scenarios, highlighting that its function was never designed for combat. Rey in Star Wars Episode VIII The Last Jedi is seen using the ability while meditating. Imagine Superman knowing how to fly, but only using it when he wanted to take a nap. Force Shock was an ability that targeted nearby enemies. This Force power had similarities to Force Lightning, but it was used to stun opponents, rendering them immobile for a period of time. We could call it the stun gun for Force-sensitive beings. Sometimes Force users could direct their Force Shock at a specific opponent, and much like a guided missile, it would only cease once it had met its target. Jedi Master Hamner employed this ability on his enemies, keeping them unconscious for a satisfactory amount of time. Of course, Vader, due to his suit, couldn't have been shooting lightning from his robotic hands, as that would have been extremely dangerous. However, Vader had a trick up his sleeve to enable him to unleash Blast of Lightning, the Vader variant. He would inflict this upon his enemies by creating Force lightning strikes that came from above. Wicked, just wicked. Flow walking was the Force ability that required a lot of caution when employed by Force-sensitive individuals. It was also a rare Force power used mostly by the Angti monks. Through flow walking, Force users could bend the past to reshape future events. Both Jason Solo and Ben Skywalker were taught by Angti monks how to use this Force power, although it had its limits. Taming beasts gave Force-sensitive beings the power to connect with animals. This ability was also known as Beast Control, Animal Bond, and Animal Kinship. For any Force user, connecting with a creature meant letting go of mental restrictions and opening themselves up to the power of the Force. Ezra Bridger in Star Wars Rebels had a strong connection to nature, which made him a master at taming beasts. The Theran Force Listening ability was associated with a cult of Force-wielding old-timers. This Force power also allowed Force users to understand languages spoken by other beings and listen to organic creatures from a distance. Qui-Gon Jinn, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Ahsoka Tano used this power during their different journeys and adventures in the Coruscant underworld. Psychometry was a rare and innate Force ability, meaning it couldn't be learned like other Force powers where users could be trained to effectively use their abilities. This Force power allowed Force-sensitive individuals to acquire information about people or places simply by touching objects they had interacted with, or locations they had visited. This ability was also known as Force Echo or Sense Echo, and it often led to Force visions. It was a valuable tool for tracking targeted opponents or finding them. In short, it was a Force power for sniffing out enemies, locating loved ones, and finding objects or places of interest. Ahsoka Tano uses this ability in Star Wars Ahsoka in an attempt to locate Sabine Wren, her stubborn and strong-willed apprentice. Force Scream was an ability more commonly associated with dark side Force-sensitive individuals. This power involved screams fueled by negative emotions such as rage, grief, and pain. However, it often occurred involuntarily, typically when a Dark Jedi or Sith Lord was overwhelmed by frustration or defeat. A notable example is Darth Vader in Revenge of the Sith. Upon being informed of Padmé's passing, his scream unleashed powerful Force-induced waves that reverberated across space. Another instance occurred when Darth Maul accidentally cut himself, triggering a Force Scream that collapsed the walls of the Orsis Academy. Maul also used the Force Scream while fighting Asajj Ventress and Obi-Wan Kenobi. During that battle, both Obi-Wan and Savage Opress struggled to stop Maul, who, in his pain, could not control the scream. The Force Grip was a telekinetically inclined force power that allowed users to firmly grab their opponents, often lifting them into the air. Force users employed this ability to immobilize, restrain, and hold their enemies all at once. The technique made it appear as though the victim was being squeezed by an invisible hand. This ability, however, was predominantly used by the dark side Force-sensitive individuals. Jedi could also use this power, but typically only when they wanted to restrain an opponent without causing harm. They exercised great caution to avoid giving in to emotions that were closely tied to the dark side. Count Dooku, in his duel against Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith, uses it to incapacitate the Jedi Master temporarily. Force users employed Force Disarm in a similar way to how they used Force Pull. However, this ability specifically targeted an opponent's weapon, pulling it away from them. This force power was especially effective at defeating enemies quickly. It often took a powerful and highly experienced Force user to disarm an opponent without much effort. A prime example is Master Yoda, who easily and swiftly disarmed Asajj Ventress when she attempted to assassinate Toydarian King Katunko. Another combat-efficient and experienced Force user who demonstrated this ability was Darth Vader, who disarmed and captured Han Solo along with his men. This force power was uniquely used by Tenebrae, also known as Darth Vitiate. It came with a pink beam of Force energy, which the user could target opponents with. However, Tenebrae would eventually use this force power for the last time in a battle that would lead to his death. Shatterpoint was a force power that functioned like a detector of weaknesses or significant events. It focused on identifying critical flaws, which could be physical, emotional, or mental. Force users skilled in this ability could easily sense these weak points and manipulate them as they saw fit. Shatterpoint could be applied to both objects and living beings. A Force user could perceive and find vulnerabilities in objects, and with the Force, shatter them into pieces. The same applied to living beings. In a fight against Darth Talon and Nina Calixte, Cade Skywalker easily detected their shatter points, injuries he himself had healed. Through this knowledge, he was able to break them by reopening their old wounds. A popular and highly efficient user of this force power was Mace Windu. Darth Sidious also sensed a shatter point in Luke Skywalker when the Tidarium landed on the Sanctuary Moon. Force projection was an extremely demanding force ability. It required users to project themselves or create a doppelganger of themselves from vast distances or anywhere in the galaxy. However, the doppelganger they created would only be an illusion, not their actual selves. This ability required immense focus and demanded the Force users give up their life essence to project themselves. It was also known as Simul Futuris, a Force technique most closely associated with the religious group known as the Falinasi. This technique had its origins in sacred text written by ancient Jedi Masters, and would eventually become Jedi Master Luke Skywalker's last resort in saving and helping the Resistance escape in the Battle of Crate against the fear-inducing and emotionally disturbed Kylo Ren. The ability to retain one's presence in the Force after death was a light side power known as Force Spirit. Users of this power included the Force Priestesses and a few Jedi Masters. Those with this rare ability underwent special training to retain their consciousness after death. One such user of this power among the Jedi was Qui-Gon Jinn. In his conversation with Master Yoda in his spirit form, he said, "All energy from the living Force, from all things that have ever lived, feeds into the cosmic force, binding everything and communicating to us through the midichlorians. Because of this, I can speak to you now." Master Yoda himself would eventually be able to use this power to appear to Luke Skywalker alongside other Jedi Masters, Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi, in Star Wars Episode VI: Return of the Jedi. Force users from both the light side and the dark side use this ability to block and deflect blaster shots. It could also be employed to counter Force lightning. Another name for this ability was Rebuke. Force-sensitive individuals, even without their lightsabers, could protect themselves if ambushed or attacked, making it a valuable substitute for blocking blaster bolts. Obi-Wan Kenobi uses this Force power while fighting Dirge, the dreaded male Gendai bounty hunter in the Clone Wars. During the first Battle of Geonosis, Master Yoda deflects Darth Tyrannus' Force lightning and also uses the ability to defend himself from Palpatine's deadly Sith lightning bolts. Shakti uses this power during her fight with General Grievous in the Battle of Hippori, deflecting a lightsaber strike. However, the intensity of the blow throws her off balance, sending her crashing into a wall. Force Meld, also known as the Jedi Meld, was an ability that drew on the collective strength or force power of Jedi. This technique allowed them to draw strength from each other by joining their minds together. Though powerful, it was considered dangerous because prolonged use of the technique could destroy the minds of every Force-sensitive participant in the meld. At certain points, the participants could begin to share identical thoughts. The technique could influence the thoughts of other participants or those at the center of the meld. If not handled carefully, and if the participants' thoughts become divided, the experience could be devastating. Joruus C'baoth used this ability more than 5 times, and became Jaina Solo's inspiration for efficiently employing the Force Meld. Luke Skywalker and Jacen Solo would later use this technique, along with Madurin, as a coordinated tactic for inter-squadron operations. Battle meditation enabled Force-sensitive individuals to enhance the efficiency of entire fleets and their soldiers, allowing them to function at maximum potential. It also allowed Force users to act as a unified entity against their enemies, simultaneously weakening the enemy's effectiveness. This power served as a boost for both the Force users and their allies in battle, even against tough opponents. Collectively, they could make their soldiers move with greater speed and coordination, making them more effective against any attack. Whether facing a large or small enemy force, the technique could be applied. Here's a quote from Jedi Master Odin one of the first Force-sensitive individuals to make this ability well known. With sufficient concentration, a Jedi, such as you or I, can strengthen the hopes of our allies and heighten the fears of our enemies. Thus, what the armies know in their hearts must become true, because they believe it so strongly. Force Meld was a more focused version of battle meditation, as it could only influence those who were Force-sensitive. Through Pyrokinesis, Force users could generate fire from their bare hands. This Force power also allowed them to manipulate fire at different points in time. They could generate fire simply by rubbing air molecules together, which would eventually produce heat by friction. Pyrokinesis was not recognized in any way as belonging to one side of the Force. Both Jedi and Sith could use the ability at any time they wanted. In a bid to save her friends and close allies, Jedi Master Nol Venari used this ability to control and redirect an explosion, but by doing so, she lost her life. Another skilled user of this Force power was Galen Marek, who even developed a massive firestorm to destroy stormtroopers attacking his allies, and to keep Darth Sidious and Vader unbalanced. Apart from Force-sensitive beings from the Jedi and Sith, other Force traditions could also employ this ability, such as the Night Sisters of Dathomir. Memory Rub was another telepathic Force power that allowed users to influence, alter, and even erase the memories of others. Many Force users have employed this ability at one time or another. For example, the Father erased Anakin Skywalker's knowledge of his future transformation into Darth Vader. On Dagobah, Master Yoda considered using this power on a historian named Arhul Hextruffen. However, acting on good conscience, he ultimately chose not to, as it did not reflect the Jedi way. Instead, Master Yoda had to trust the historian to keep his location secret. After the Yuuzhan Vong War, Jacen Solo added this power to his repertoire of Force techniques. He learned it from the Falanasi, a religious order dedicated to the light side, or as they commonly called it, the White Current. Users of the Mind Probe used this to gain access to the thoughts and emotions of their victim. With it, one could get information on locations, places, people, and even intentions. Those who were easily susceptible to this ability were individuals who were mentally and emotionally unstable. Finding any info on their minds was simply like clicking a button or taking ice cream from a Padawan. Not sure that that's simple, though. Due to the discomfort and intrusion that individuals would experience from this force power, Jedi were restricted from using it on anyone, including their opponents. However, Jedi Master Luke Skywalker, on certain occasions, felt compelled to yank out this ability on some victims. You also see Darth Vader use this ability in the duel between himself and his son, the same Luke Skywalker, and this was how he found out he had a twin sister. What a way to find out you have two kids, and one of them's trying to kill you. Force Drain actually wasn't just one technique, but rather a wide spectrum of force techniques. However, they were all rooted in the same core principle to use the dark side to drain the force energy away from other living beings. Depending on the practitioner's mastery, the ability could vary in scale and strength, either only targeting a single victim or other times being able to drain an entire area. The effect on its victims also varied. At its peak, it could either exhaust victims gradually or annihilate them almost instantly. The specific force drain ability called Drain Life was able to drain the life essence of a target and transfer it to the user of the ability and replenish or heal them. The effect of Drain Life on the user was actually rather similar to the results of Force Healing. However, the difference lay therein that the restoration of their health didn't come from harmony with the Force, but rather by draining the life energy of someone else to restore oneself. To do that, the user had to be in complete unison with the dark side of the Force. Another branch of Force Drain was the Power Drain Force, which didn't directly harm the body, but rather stripped away an enemy's connection to the Force while replenishing the wielder's reserves. Similarly, Force Diminish allowed a practitioner to steadily erode an opponent's physical vitality and mental fortitude, weakening their victim's body almost to the point of death. Several different powerful Sith Lords demonstrated Force Drain on various scales. Darth Malak, for example, during the climactic duel on the Starforge, combined aspects of both life and force-draining techniques. He drew upon the life and force energy of captive Jedi taken in the attack on Dantooine, feeding on their essence to replenish his own energy while dueling Revan. Darth Bane was able to unleash a deadly spherical field of pure dark side energy around himself, which instantly withered the life of anyone caught within its radius. However, the technique was so draining that Bane found it highly impractical to employ without external aid. Despite its immense power, Force Drain was not without severe risks. Reliance upon it could corrode the very body and spirit of its wielder, with devastating consequences. A prime example was Darth Nihilus, the most powerful user of the Force Drain ability. As he was a wound in the Force, he had a never-ending appetite for the Force essence of other beings. His force-feeding ability allowed him to consume the Force essence of entire populations, but it also enslaved him to the hunger itself, transforming him into little more than a vessel of hunger that could never stop feeding. What also makes this ability unique is that it couldn't really be taught, but was rather an instinctual thing that could only be gained by experiencing the technique firsthand. That's why it wasn't an ability that's seen often, as not every dark side user could simply just learn it. However, for the users that did master its ability, it was one of the deadliest force power in the galaxy. Force Storm was an exceptionally volatile dark side ability and considered one of the most powerful force abilities in existence. There were two different versions. The first one allowed the user to generate hyperspace wormholes that destabilized the very fabric of time-space continuum, tearing open rifts within the universe itself. The Force Storm itself would show itself as a sort of tornado or wormhole. Once unleashed, it could both displace ships and fleets across the galaxy and devastate a planet's surface in moments. However, to summon a Force Storm required the user to have complete mastery over the dark side of the Force. The user was required to channel his entire hatred and anger into the ability. The difficulty was, though, that Force Storms were notoriously hard to control. The user could easily lose control of it should his focus be broken even momentarily. Losing control of it would mean that the storm would start to spiral out of control and start consuming random things that get into its path. The reborn Emperor Palpatine used this ability to conjure up a Force Storm to destroy the New Republic fleet over Pinnacle Moon. However, after Luke managed to beat him in a duel, he lost control over the storm and it went on to destroy the Super Star Destroyer Eclipse. As Palpatine got killed by the Force Storm, it dissipated. What made the Force Storm even more special was that it wasn't just a destructive tool. Palpatine actually showed that he could use the Force Storm to transport living beings safely across the galaxy and basically teleport them across the galaxy in an instant. This ability was used to transport Luke to Biss as Palpatine tried to convert him to the dark side. The remarkable thing was that he was at Biss and conjured the Force Storm over Coruscant, which mean that it could be used from enormous distances. The second version of the Force Storm was where the user would use the Force to manipulate the weather in a pocket of several kilometers. The Force Storm would show itself by having the clouds come together and having rain soak the Earth. Furthermore, strong winds and lightning would make it dangerous enough to ground any ships to the ground. It was most notably seen in the Star Wars Rebels Season 3 finale, where Bendu used a weather force storm to destroy Thrawn's fleet on Atollon before he was shot down. Notably, he seemed to be able to redirect the storm's lightning at specific targets. Force Kill was more of an overterm used for any Force technique that was used with the intention to kill another being. Force Kill was usually used to telekinetically destroy a victim's internal organs, for example by stopping their heart from beating. Darth Bane used Force Kill against his own father by envisioning a giant hand crushing his father's heart. His father died instantly. Dooku apparently used the ability by stopping some random black market dealer's heart instantly, and also used a variation of it to slow General Grievous's heartbeat to keep him alive, as Grievous was close to death after his shuttle crash that forced him to keep the transformation into a cyborg. But to be honest, I don't think it's the best described technique there is. Finally, Force Deadly Sight, which is one of the most obscure abilities we've talked about here. It was rooted in the dark side, and the technique channeled a practitioner's fury and hatred into waves of energy, which were then projected outward through nothing more than the user's gaze. So basically, they'd just stare down someone and be able to inflict injury and pain upon them. Depending on the strength of the users, their glare could even make their victim's skin blister, and their bodies began to burn and smoke as they withered away toward death. Obviously, this ability was not taught by the Jedi, and its only mention was in the Star Wars Jedi Knight video games, and wasn't really used ever since. Force Crush was technically part of the Force Grip abilities, where the user would use the Force to grip certain parts of another being's body. Force Choke, for example, would also be in this category. Force Crush, however, was considered one of the most violent and devastating applications of the Force. It was usually used by lifting an opponent into the air, suspending them helplessly, and then compressing their body with enough pressure that it imploded inward, crushing bones and organs. Due to the brutality of the ability, most Jedi regarded it as being aligned to the dark side, and its use against organic beings was forbidden overall. However, there were still rare instances where some Jedi used the ability, as there was some uses for it, especially against vehicles or droids. I most vividly remember Obi-Wan using it against 2 commando droids after he got beat up to stall the Zygerian Enforcer, until Anakin could disarm the bombs on Kadavo. Luke Skywalker also used it in the Mandalorian Season 2 finale to crush a Dark Trooper. Mace Windu used it against General Grievous right when Grievous was about to escape Coruscant with the Chancellor. Windu crushed Grievous's lungs, which left the general seriously wounded, and he forthon kept having his wheezing cough. Anakin also used it to crush a Skakoan scientist's armor, leaving him crippled and most likely dead. Though we all know that Anakin was always kinda on the edge of the dark side, so it's not quite the same. Among Sith and dark side users, however, Force Crush was far more common. Vader supposedly used it as a form to execute Imperial officers that disappointed him. Darth Bane also used this ability to crush his beaten Sith opponent Cordus, by lifting him into the air and slowly crushing his body with the Force by simply clenching his fist. And of course, Galen Merrick also used it by crushing an AT-ST Walker with it, as he's always here to show you just how far a Force ability can be taken. Force Morichro was a rather unique Force technique. Its core function was the ability to slow the biological processes of oneself or another being, reducing the body's functions to a near standstill. With this technique, they could make another being's body functions stop working, say like organs and such, and slowly starve them. If it was used on oneself, Morichro would have the user enter a trance-like state, where a Jedi would reduce their own body functions to, say, recover from an injury or similar. Through it, they could reduce biological functions such as breathing and heartbeat, and make users even survive without food, water, and even without air. Because of its ability to potentially kill people, Morichro was forbidden by the Jedi. However, there were exceptions, as always. Master Yaddle had rediscovered the ability after it was forgotten for a long time and mastered it over time. Force Fear was a dark side force power, often considered a corrupted and stronger version of the Jedi mind trick. The ability worked by delving into the deepest recesses of a target's mind, amplifying their most primal terrors. Victims would be struck with an uncontrollable, shaking fear that crippled their ability to think or act in any way. The effects of this power varied depending on the individual targeted. In some cases, it completely stripped away courage, leaving the victim cowering defensively. In others, it provoked an overwhelming urge to outright flee from the wielder. Due to that, it was considered a dark side ability, especially since fear itself is a central emotion that leads to the dark side. There were also two even more advanced versions of Force Fear, these being Force Horror and Force Insanity. Force Horror could affect multiple people at the same time, and the people it affected would enter a state of absolute panic, suffering a far stronger effect than from Force Fear alone. Force Insanity was the most devastating manifestation of the Force Fear powers. As the name suggests, targets of Force Insanity would descend into a state of frenzy, deranged mania, and hysteria as their minds buckled under the impression that their situation seemed absolutely hopeless. Darth Zana was extremely well versed in this ability, and combined it with Sith alchemy to make it effective against even the strongest Force users like Darth Bane. She used Force Fear on a Chiss woman, for example, and brought her so insane that she tore her own eyes out with her fingers. Although the ability was forbidden by the Jedi, there were some that would use this ability in rare cases to defuse certain situations. Say, an aggressive individual was about to attack and they used Force Fear on them. They'd be immobilized long enough to defuse it. However, it was frowned upon by Jedi as usually a simple mind trick would have worked just as well without having to make their victims tremble in terror. Mind Domination, also referred to as Control Mind, was a dark side power often described as the direct counterpart to the Jedi mind trick. However, unlike the relatively subtle persuasion of the mind trick, which implanted suggestions or nudged decisions, Mind Domination was far more invasive. This ability allowed the practitioner to seize complete control over the thoughts and actions of their target, stripping the victim of their autonomy entirely. Due to that, it was forbidden by the Jedi and considered a dark side ability. The level of control over the other individual's mind depended on the user's skill and strength in the Force. At higher levels of mastery, a single practitioner could dominate the minds of multiple individuals at once, bending entire groups to his will. Emperor Vitiate was very well known for his ability to completely dominate the minds of his subordinates, even being able to break the minds of extremely powerful beings like Revan and Malak, while also having full control over his Imperial guards.